the Cinematologists podcast, Season 18. In the first episode of the new season, Neil and Dario discuss Christopher Morris's new quiet film, A Year in a Field. Neil hosted an onstage conversation with director Chris and producer Denzil Monk at a preview for the film before it goes on a nationwide cinema tour. Elsewhere in the episode, Neil and Dario discuss the new season and what lies ahead for the podcast, and in response to the onstage conversation, discuss the potential for a political cinema and how the film asks questions about individualism, community, and collective action. Welcome back to the podcast. On with the show.
Hello and welcome to Season 18 of the Cinematologists podcast. It's great to be back. I'm Dario Linares, and joining me, of course, is my good friend and partner in this ongoing endeavour, Neil Fox. Welcome, Neil.
Hello, Dario. Hello, everyone. It is glorious to be back for Season 18, and raring to go. Exciting times. How are you doing?
Well, I'm pretty fraught, I have to say, especially after all the shenanigans in the last 5 minutes with trying to get a new system up and running. But yeah, just coming to the end of Welcome Week for our academic colleagues. We'll know what that's all about. And yeah, just a really, really super busy time, but really looking forward to a lot of what's going to happen in the next few weeks on the podcast, but also in film world with the interviews we've got coming up, and the London Film Festival and many other things.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, it's a crazy time of year. There's a crazy time in HE generally, but yeah, there's a good season ahead, and yeah, some really interesting and fun chats coming your way, listeners. So yeah, it's really good to be back, and yeah, can't wait to get kicked off.
No, absolutely, and I mean, it's been an interesting summer because we've kind of taken a bit more of a hiatus, a longer hiatus, and kind of stopped doing the newsletters for 3 months. But for our Patreon subscribers, the newsletters are coming back. But we also did quite a bit of really fun content over the summer. I was house sitting for Neil, and I raided his DVD collection and did some sort of impromptu recordings of his Blu-rays, which is great fun. And then Neil has done a kind of quite extensive report on some of his summer viewing, and that's available for our Patreon subscribers. But we really want to extend that content, so the newsletter will be coming back, and we're going to do some adjacent open access podcasts, which will be available to everyone. Yeah, I don't know about you, Neil, but I'm really looking forward to sort of being able to produce our Patreon content kind of adjacent and complementary to the main feed, and yeah, really hoping that we get some more Patreon subscribers, because I think it is obviously it's the same, it's us in that sense, but it does offer us a slightly different angle into certain subjects, and maybe a little bit more personal, a little bit more freeform. So anybody who this season who wants to get even more cinematologist content, there will be stuff on the Patreon site.
Yeah, we talked about that, didn't we, over the summer, in terms of, like, as we were always doing, really kind of thinking about ways to freshen up what we do, kind of extend what we do, and sort of bring in different things. And I think certainly the approaches that we took to the bonus episodes in the summer sort of made us think, actually, yeah, it would be nice to do some of this stuff that sits alongside that, but was available to all, just to kind of extend people's experience if they want, rather than just sort of have it very, very kind of, well, not formalized, but sort of as it has been for a while now. So hopefully our kind of dedicated Patreon subscribers will understand that decision. And we'll still be back with our kind of extensive newsletter once a month for them, which has been, really, that's been refreshed in the last year as well. So we kind of keep thinking about ways to make sure that our Patreons are getting their value for their buck, but also, using that platform as a way to kind of, do something which is a little bit more freeform. And it's been interesting because over the last week or so, I've been listening to some podcasts with people who use Patreon for music, and they were sort of saying the same thing. It's a space for, kind of more informality, more kind of experimentation. So hopefully there'll be some stuff that people will respond to over there. And it might, you never know, it might sort of end up kind of shaping the main episodes down the line as well. I think, that sort of space for experimentation is really important for keeping it going. So look out for some interesting stuff dropping over there in the next sort of month or so.
Yeah, and it's funny anyway because we don't exactly have a sort of tight segmentation on the main show anyway. I know we like to say pretentious words like freeform and eclectic and what have you. I just always remember Mark Jenkin, our friend, calling it random. So which is fine, of course. But just sort of keeping that sense as ever that we're going in directions that kind of we want to go in, and the audience, really, it's up to them, and if they want to be along for the ride, that's great, and we definitely welcome that. I don't know about you, Neil, but just before we get into the main part of the episode, it's been a really odd summer for me for kind of film watching. It seems to have been really dominated at the start by, the Barbie Oppenheimer thing, and never really has fully recovered. It was almost kind of like a vacuum of film conversation, and I don't think I've really seen anything this year. I mean, there's maybe one film that is just being released now that I'm thinking, oh yeah, that's definitely going to be on my end of year top 5. But I'm really interested to sort of go to the London Film Festival and see what's coming out there. But I hesitate to say is this going to be a disappointing year? But it just, with the strikes as well, it just feels like there's a very, there's a lot of uncertainty around where film is just at the moment.
Yeah, interesting. I was thinking quite similarly recently in terms of, like my film watching this whole year really has not been dominated by what's come out this year. Like I haven't seen Barbie, I haven't seen Oppenheimer, and I've seen very little that you could class as sort of being released this year. And I was thinking, actually, I sort of following the festivals a lot and seeing Mubi particularly picking up a lot of titles. And, I imagine that sort of November and December on Mubi is going to be very, very full of, sort of 2023 releases. So I think it's going to, if I have an interest in that, I think it's going to be catching up a lot down there. And I think, the last time I went to the cinema, I think was Asteroid City.
Oh yeah, of course.
So it's like that was before that. I think it was when we watched Master Gardener. It's very kind of sporadic cinema visits, and even then on online, it's not really the stuff that's coming out. So I'm really interested to see what my sort of end of year reflection looks like. I can imagine that there's very little that will actually be out this year, and certainly maybe not of any of those sort of those big hitters. But I think my viewing sort of stepped up a lot, but not necessarily in the new release realm. And I am looking forward to London Film Festival, which we're both accredited for, and hoping that there's some sort of gems that come through there. And I know there's a couple of films that I reached out to about screeners that I'm really excited about.
Yeah, no, it's going to be great, London, and I think we're probably just going to be able to do one episode, but there may be sort of bonuses along the way, hopefully. But just to give you a sort of sense of the shape of the coming season, we've got there's a Rock Hudson documentary coming out, and I'm interviewing the director for that. Neil, you're gonna interview our friend James Dean, who's a producer on this new comedy Apocalypse Clown. So that's to come. And also, similar to other episodes we've done previously, which we try to delve into other film podcasters, we're interviewing Rico Galliano of the Movie Podcast. And I was just really taken with his last season on popular music in films. So all of those are in the can. Have I missed anything out there, Neil, in terms of what's coming up?
No, I think that's it in terms of what's definitely confirmed. And yeah, hope there'll be some other stuff that will drop in, sort of irons in fires, as they say. I'm sure that, that things will come out of the festival season as well that we might pick up on.
Yeah, and just to say, if you are a regular listener, and this is, of course, the new episode of the new season, so we are going to hit very hard the sharing on the social media for what it's worth these days, but on as many channels as we can. And yeah, so if you do have the opportunity and a little bit of time to share your love of the podcast, whether that's verbally to other film lovers or share on social media, or really dropping us a review on your podcast app of choice or on iTunes, it really is a big help. And whenever anybody writes like a blog, and many people have done that about the podcast, sometimes people write stuff listing their favorite film shows. It's all really greatly received. It really is, and we want to have another sort of boost when it comes to the listener numbers, just to share the love of the show. So, without any further ado, Neil, why don't you introduce the subject of today's podcast, because this one was definitely your baby.
Yeah, so this is a film called A Year in a Field. It's directed by Christopher Morris, a documentary filmmaker, and it's a film that I've worked on, so it's definitely sort of a film that I'm very, very familiar with. It's released in cinemas now. Chris is on a tour with it around the country, so you can catch it in a variety of cities with Chris doing a Q&A, and it's on a solstice release, so it's kind of released this weekend to coincide with the autumn equinox, and will be in cinemas until the winter solstice, when it'll be on streaming. And the reason that's significant is because it's a film about a standing stone in a menhir in West Penwith in West Cornwall, near where Chris lives, and it's his kind of relationship with the stone really over a period of time, and how spending time in that space with the stone sort of slowly brings out some feelings that he's sort of been pondering around the climate crisis, and just kind of his place in the world and our place on the planet, really.
No, it's a beautiful piece of work, but also it's a piece of work that I think reveals a lot of the issues that we're grappling with, in a broader sense around the environment and what the now looks like, never mind the future, but also the role of cinema in sort of being a political intervention into that, or whether cinema ends up just being a kind of a sort of document of this inevitable process of catastrophe, for want of a better phrase. And Neil, I'm definitely interested in sort of talking about that element, as how much that element of the film, in terms of how much you see it as a political film, and what is a political film these days. Because I think that, there isn't any solution to this, but it does sort of leave unanswered questions, doesn't it? So a very sort of a film that requires you to think through subjects that have no easy answers.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to getting into that as well, and that is something that did come up in the conversation, the audience conversation that forms the main part of this episode, in terms of the idea of a kind of a political cinema, or kind of almost a kind of politics v cinema, and how the two intersect. This is a conversation that was held earlier this week at the Poly in Falmouth as part of a kind of welcome week preview of the film before Chris goes on tour for the new student at the School of Film and Television. And I was joined on stage for the conversation by Chris and the producer Denzil Monk.
Great, let's get into that now.
I've never glued my hand to a road, or doused a wildfire, or strapped myself to a tree in Brazil. Never been there. And I've never been on a protest march. This is a quiet, unnoticed one-man vigil. a small, direct action of stillness.
Thanks everyone. Please welcome producer Denzil Monk and director Christopher Morris. So yeah, thanks for joining us today. So in the room we have a group of students undertaking the very start of their degree, and in the recent issue of Movie Notebook, the great slow filmmaker Simon Liang has shared his advice for filmmakers. So I'm going to use that as a way of sort of framing our conversation with a few of his kind of things that he thinks filmmakers should consider, and then I'll open it up to our audience to ask questions. So if you guys want to have some questions ready, go for it. So we're going to start with Si's first kind of advice to filmmakers, which is think of location as a character, which I think sits very well. So Chris, can you talk about this location, what it means to you, and how you sort of came to this project?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for coming. I live about a mile, well, just under a mile from that field, and I moved here in 2015, and within a few weeks of moving here, I stumbled across the field, got lost actually, and then I ended up in a field with a standing stone, and the standing stone was like a magnet, so you walk to it, don't you? And there was just something. I mean, I'm from Wales. Where we used to live in Wales, we were surrounded by Bronze Age this and Bronze Age that, and West Cornwall, where I live, down the other side of Penzance, near Land's End, you're surrounded. We both lived down that way, and we were surrounded by Bronze Age. But there was something about this stone. I knew nothing about it. And because I was running the film school here, I just started, I knew I wouldn't be able to make films for a while, so I began to photograph it. And for 6 years I photographed it, kind of religiously, in a good way, religiously, just as a sort of a photo project. So, and it's on Instagram if you want to have a look at standing underscore granite. I'm nearly at 1,000 followers, so I reckon if everybody follows me, I'm gonna crack it today. But it was never meant for that. It was just meant as a project for me, really. I didn't care who followed me, there was something about this field which is hard to define. You can see the sea. It has a great sense of space above it, and it's enclosed. So it is both open and closed at the same time. So it's surrounded, it's boxed in, but it's also open. It's hard to say why it attracted me, but it just did. And then obviously in the film, it really becomes the protagonist and the landscape in which everything happens. There's a really good quote. I can't say it. I can't remember what it is, but Barbara Hepworth, the great British sculptor from the 1930s, she moved down from West Scarborough, wherever that is, Yorkshire, East Yorkshire. She moved down to live in Cornwall, and she wrote about the fact that walking through and seeing the stones that were shaped by the sea even were like figures in the landscape, and that if you look at her sculpture, you can really see the Cornish influence on all that. And that resonated very much in my head when I was looking at this stone. It just becomes a figure. So there is no human in it.
Should probably plug the great film figures in a landscape about Barbara Hepworth. It would be a really nice accompaniment piece to watch alongside this. I think you can watch it on the BFI player online now, and it plays in the tape in St Ives as well. It's an incredible. It was actually the first film commissioned by the BFI Experimental Film Unit, which existed once upon a time. So yeah, it comes from that same place.
Yeah, that is on the BFI player. And you call it in the film a sentinel, which kind of taps into that idea of the kind of the figurative and the kind of the, sort of, the ability to project onto that and for it to also project outwards.
Yeah, I mean, while the film was going, I'm just preparing a post to put on my Instagram standing granite, and it's a letter to Mr. Sunak to for the folly of pulling back on his climate commitments, and the Stone is inviting him to come and see the film in London and to bring his children, because it is his children who will have to suffer the consequences of his diabolical actions. But ultimately, the Stone absorbs, in my head, the Stone absorbs and acts as a touch point for our what we call progress. So the obvious synergies are there with other films. There's science fiction films that I've always loved, like 2001, particularly The Black Monolith, which is there and marks the changes in human progress. Well, My Black Monolith stands there and absorbs the folly, I guess, of where we are. That's how I read it. I didn't start there. I won't come on to that, but that developed as the film went along. I didn't start off with that in my head, and I think it's pretty obvious in the film how the film develops that actually those are the things that began to emerge as the film was made.
Yeah, and you emerge as the film is made, don't you? In terms of where you start as a kind of in terms of your politics and your activism and where you end up, and that's a very outwardly political statement you just made there, which feels very different to the person who maybe started the film process. Simon Liang says your film reflects who you are at the moment. It should match your level of maturity, and you're quite kind of outspoken, but very kind of direct about this is a film that 60-year-old Chris had to make and couldn't have been made by 20-year-old, 18-year-old Chris.
It's so important, this. I couldn't have made this film when I was starting at film school myself, or even when I was in my career at the BBC. That wasn't. It's not that I wouldn't have wanted to make a film about this subject if I was that age. It's just that something about the fact that I've lived 6 decades gives me an ability to kind of reflect back while I was making the film about the kind of life I was born into, which was so wholly different from this life we live today with phones and plastic and things. It was plastic in the 60s, but the whole of our culture has changed vastly in my lifetime. I think, and suddenly standing there for hours on end allowed me space and time to reflect back on that and then put it into the film. That's such a good phrase. What was that phrase, the first one, about that he says?
Your film reflects who you are at the moment.
Exactly. And so I think you can probably see in the film that I changed a lot. So about 3/4 of the way through the film I say I've never been on a protest march. And that was because, and there's no mention of climate change in the first 20 minutes of the film. None at all. But that reflects exactly the journey I went on. Now, I wasn't concerned with climate change, because of course I was. But then there became a sort of dial where I'm quite a calm person, and it takes a lot to get me riled, and that dial sort of grew through the years. So I ended up by, of course, joining Extinction Rebellion and going on the last march in April in London. But really the film isn't about that. I think the film reflects my growing ability to sort of deal with it on a different level than I had before.
Yeah. Sai says, the art of waiting for a train to pass, waiting for a flock of birds to arrive, which feels very, very stupid. But we talked the other week about, and you sort of said it's not really slow cinema. We don't consider it slow cinema because of what goes on. But I was thinking about this, and I think it's a very different type of slow cinema in that it slowly became cinema.
you know, that it took a long time for you to realise actually that this is a film. So what was it like in terms of that moment of shooting moving footage as opposed to still footage, and then talk a little bit about the process of bringing Denzil in, and then to where it is now, if that's not too big?
No, I can say. So I was photographing it. Then one day I go to see the stone, and there was a feather caught in the lichen. And in fact, it's in the film later on because another feather caught in the lichen. So if you remember, there's a bit where the feather flies away. And I photographed it, and it just didn't look very good because, of course, the feather was moving. So then I flicked the switch on the camera, and I started filming it. And that was the first moving shot of the stone that I'd taken. Then I took another one, There was no intent to make a film, and there was no intent that I thought I might put these up on the internet instead of stills. But then I started just making more and more of these images. And then I found a book on my bookshelf I picked up at a junk shop 10 years previously called A Year in the Life of the Field by a proper ecologist called Michael Allaby, who started the Soil Association and part of the organic movement, etc. He's a brilliant writer, etc. And he'd written it in 1981, 40 years previously, in a Cornish field. And at that point, I kind of like put two and two together, and I thought, oh, okay, I've got my Bible, I'll follow what he did a year, and I will collect my shots now into something approaching thing. And then, but I had no expectation. It was just a personal project. Then I went for lunch with Denzil. You pick up the story.
Yeah. So, well, Chris told me what he do. I've been following the Instagram, and I'm a great lover of Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments anyway, a stone plover, and yeah, you said you'd start. I think you'd cut together a little bit of some harvest.
No,
material.
you asked me to do.
Oh,
you
did I
asked me
ask
to
you?
do
Oh,
that.
okay.
No, there was nothing.
I'm conflating. Okay, I said, well, you've been filming stuff. You should cut something together. Then that must be where it started. And shortly afterwards, you sent me a 10-15 minute clip of some of the autumn equinox harvest stuff there with the music pretty much as it is in the film. And at that point, I thought this could be an amazing piece of slow cinema, because that's what it was at that point. And then we started talking more about it, and it just kind of over time evolved. And you started writing what becomes the voiceover on it, and it kind of, and for me watching the film now, it's so far removed from slow cinema. There's so much going on in it. There's definitely, it has its own pace, and it kind of, you know, it particularly the opening, it brings you into the pace of the film, because you can't be frenetic about a 4,000-year-old stone in a field over a year. You've got to slow down our usual kind of expectations a bit to just meet that place somewhere. But then there's so many ideas and reflections about our existence then, now, the kind of the different ways that we perceive time that are going on through it, that
Yeah, I think on the poster we put it's a quiet film, and actually it's not that quiet either, but it's sort of just helping the audience understand that they're coming to see something where lots of cinemas or people I've been talking to say it's such an unusual film. I don't actually, or such an unconventional film. I don't think it's unconventional at all. It's like 4 chapters, spring, autumn, you know, whatever. I mean, it's not unconventional, but so it's somewhere between slow and quiet.
I think maybe what people perceive as unconventional is the fact that it comes out of the genesis of how the film came into being and how it evolved, that because it was just, you know, a very small team of people, you know, largely yourself working on it for large swathes of time, no kind of commissioning framework, no kind of expectation of what it should be, and really just letting the film emerge from the experience of making it. It was an evolutionary process, and it's quite rare that a film is able to be made in that way. Even documentary is able to be made in that way without. It's not necessarily that there's interference, but just that there's all these other voices and expectations and ideas of what's right and what's wrong, what should be, what shouldn't be, and the conventions that brings with it. I think one of the things that was beautiful about the process of making this was that it was completely free of that. It just kind of, it was a labour of love, and it kind of, I think it allowed it to blossom into the film that it wanted to be.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, to go back to your original question, the moment it became cinema was when Denzil gave me affirmation that what I was doing was beyond what I was doing. And him saying, cut something together, and I went, oh no, oh, okay. And but I physically had to sit down and cut something. And so I cut a sequence, and a mate's music I shoved on top, which is Sarah's music, which is now all the way through the film. And I just sent it to him. But it was that affirmation back, and even after, you know, I'm an experienced filmmaker, it's still brilliant to have somebody else say, actually, no, what you are doing, actually, it's got some worth. And at that moment, and it was at that moment completely, it went from being a collection of shots that I was collecting that one day I would turn into something, a short or something. It just then became a project. And you can see then that also it became, what's the worth? What's the point of it all? The point, it can't just be four sections. And then I'd be keeping notes and details all the way through, reading the news. I'm an avid reader of magazines and stuff, so New Scientist magazine I have every week, and I was reading reports about this, about, you know, a lot of the stuff that's in there. And I also listened to a brilliant Radio 4 programme that's coming to the end of its tenure this Friday, called In Our Time, which is Melvin Bragg, who's in his 80s now, I believe, and every week he brings academics to talk about something, and it could be one week it will be Herodotus, or it will be Emily Bronte, or it will be photosynthesis. There is one on photosynthesis, or it will be the electron, or it will be, and then it will be ice. There was what the things about water coming from outer space all came from that program. And there was a brilliant program about how the Earth was formed, and Thea smashing into Korea. That all came from listening to this radio program. I can't praise it enough. It's bonkers and eclectic and wonderful. So it all came from those things. All came together the moment that he said, "Actually, there's something in this," and I can't stress how important that was.
Lots to say in response to that. One of the things, just to go back a little bit, was that the unconventionality. I think what is unconventional about it is in the genre, the very loose genre of kind of the ecological film, or the kind of the nature documentary, or the, you know, the kind of the crisis documentary, where there is a sense of telling the audience very directly what to think, how to feel, and this film doesn't do that. We learn a lot about how you feel, and you give us the space as an audience to feel along with you. But I think it is unconventional in terms of it's not presenting answers, it's presenting ideas. It's not yelling those ideas. It's just sort of providing the space. So I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that. Sai also says you can also make a film with a crew of 5, which refers to that, and then make films in
double what this was.
So, yeah, exactly. Yeah,
5 times.
We've had 5 people doing this, and also make films in accordance with your resources. And what I think is interesting to talk about in the context of where we are today is the fact that the process of making a film reflects what the film is about. So Denzil, you talk a little bit about that, because that's something that's very close to Bosena's heart as a kind of production company. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think, you know, so we talk about Bosena as an ecosophical production company, and an ecosophy is the kind of the philosophy of ecological harmony. Every film has its own ecosophy, and I think this isn't an ecological film, it is an ecosophical film. There's a philosophy that is about your experience of that year and of everything that's going on in the world around it, that sits at the heart of it. So it kind of it's a very reflexive film. It sort of folds in on itself and emerges from that process as well. I think there's you can't separate the form and the content and the process. And the process of making this was very simple emergent and kind of an evolutionary thing, and that's reflected in the content of the film and the way, the structure of it, and the way that it's kind of put together as a piece of cinema.
So I'm going to turn it over after this question, so get ready. Sai says Bresson, Bergman, Orson Welles, Akira Kurosawa. Should be obvious to everyone in this room. But when I see that, when I think back to that idea of it being unconventional, I think as well, one of the things that might need stating is that you're coming from a very specific cinematic perspective. You know, so to you it's kind of rooted in a kind of form of cinematic storytelling. So you talk a little bit about the kinds of films and filmmakers that sort of you would put this film in a dialogue with, to give it sort of wider sort of cinematic context.
Well, as I said, I think there's a lot of science fiction influence in everything that I do. I love science fiction, and but it's beyond that. Oh gosh, that's such a good question. I would put, the things that are behind everything I do would be Stanley Kubrick, Jacques Tati, and most recently, it's gone up here. Yeah, I love him so much, I've forgotten his name. You the Living.
Oh, Roy Anderson.
Roy Anderson. Yeah, absolutely love the formality of his work. And his work is all about humans and human beings in close thing. It couldn't be more different. Jacques Tati is all again about the kind of human interaction and misunderstanding of human interaction. Couldn't be more different. But the thing that is consistent with both films, particularly as opposed to Kubrick, those two filmmakers, Roy Anderson and Jacques Tati, is the stillness in the camera and the stillness in the shot. And I've fallen in love with that over the years as I've become as my documentaries went on and on. And actually, the previous films I've made, documentaries, I made a film about sex work amongst student population. It was a drama doc, and again, a deliberate understanding of where you use handheld and for what reason, and why you keep the camera still and allow everything to happen within the frame was such an influence on me. So yeah, and when you speak, I'll remember some more if I can remember their names.
Denzil.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we talked about before, there's kind of there's an element of coyness, quatsy in the latter part of the film, and that's certainly, I don't remember when I first watched it, but that film had a massive impact on me when I first saw it, and I think has been buzzing around in the back of my head somewhere ever since, and it kind of. Again, it's kind of like an antithesis of this in a way, because that's all, sort of mechanised society, and harking back to Man with a Movie Camera, it's all about human processes, mechanised processes, and setting that against natural processes and playing with time in really interesting ways. And this film does that, but it does it from a point of ancient stasis rather than contemporary or sort of modern world. Mechanised commodification, but those elements are there as well. They're just there as the rotting bit of detritus in the hedge, and and the ships passing in the distance. So it's playing with all those same ideas, but from such a different perspective.
Yeah, I was really lucky a few years ago to go and see a screening of Coin Scotsy in Cardiff, and Philip Glass live with 6 Moog. Or six synthesizers, a synthesizer orchestra playing live. It was beyond, and and perhaps if there's a question about the music, I could talk a little bit more about the music, because obviously that last 10 minutes is a kind of Philip Glass-esque piece, which is kind of a little homage to that. The editing in something like Baraka, if you know Baraka, which was made by the cameraman who worked on Coin Squadzy, I would say that's a massive influence. The editing style, that idea of deliberate big junctions between landscape scenes, was really influential.
Great. And so I would agree in terms of your ideas around stillness, because he says stillness is not a complete lack of movement, for time continues to pass second by second in your film. Definitely.
Absolutely.
Kind of captures that. Right. Who wants to say something? So we've got a microphone, so please wait for it to come round.
At the back there,
There's one right at the back, yeah, in the corner. Sorry, Kingsley, right to the...
Well, talking about the music, I saw, I really like those last 10 minutes. Like the way you mix, there was a mix of the music. Do you think there's music in nature? And also, do you think there's music in a modern world, a technological world, as opposed to with nature?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, and actually there was no intention to use music initially. And so again, as I say, I was collecting shots. Then when Denzil asked me to cut something, I only had the sound available that was on camera sound. So it was just rubbish. So then I thought, well, for Denzil, I'll stick a bit of music on it, and that was a game changer really, because yeah. But to answer your question, I think there is music in nature, and I think you could make this film with that, with found sound, beautifully.
There are sections of it that are, I mean, the sort of the midsummer section, where there's long, just the sound of insects and nothing else. It's definitely musical.
Yeah, we had, as I say, nobody really came to the field with me apart from this brilliant sound recordist called Bronwyn Buckeridge, who teaches fine art here. She, on fine art, she's an artist who, her practice is around capturing wildlife sound, and then she works that into her practice. So she came to the field 2 or 3 times during the spring and summer to capture the amazing sound of the things, but she turned up with these microphones, and they were hand-built. She built them herself, and they were the size of this chair, and she had 2 of them. She clunked into the field, whacked them down, and then she'd do 10-hour recordings. I mean, it was the maddest thing. She did one overnight. She sort of arrived at 8, put it down, and then came back at 8 the next morning with a 12-hour recording of the field. There you are, Chris. And it was amazing. It was all that buzzing and all that stuff was recorded by Bronwyn. So yeah, you could easily have the music. I think just to say that the one thing I like about this music more than anything is it was not written for the film. So it was Sarah Moody, who was a composer in Bristol, who I've worked with on a couple of other projects. She's a cellist and all-round musical genius. And I just said to her, look, have you got a back catalogue of stuff that I could just raid? And she said, well, there's this stuff, and this stuff is in the film. And most of it was composed for theatre pieces in Bristol for children, or for commission pieces for churches or whatever. So, for example, the Philip Glass piece at the end is a children's show called The Hare and the Tortoise, that famous fable. And so the Philip Glass mad was when the rabbit was running, and I just took all that and took it out of its original context and recycled it. So one of the reasons I liked it was because it was a low carbon approach to using music in the film, because it already existed in the world. So nobody drove anywhere to do anything or expended any carbon making it. I just recycled it. But it was fun to go through hours of her work. And then what I found was, when I was going through, you'd hear a piece like, it's near the harvest scene, I think, and it goes, la 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 la, and you were listening to this beautiful voices just singing that, and then a picture that you knew that I had already shot popped into my head, and that I'd try them together. And so it wasn't. It was a brilliant creative process. The only bits that were composed are the beginning and the end, and perhaps I could talk about that briefly. The opening dawn shot and the woman singing at the end in Cornish are taken from an opera, and it's by Wagner, and it's Das Rheingold, the Rheingold. Now, if you know that opera, and this is why one of the things that you have to do while you're at film school is not just watch films. You need to imbibe every influence you can, including things you don't think you like. Maybe that could include opera for those who don't know it. But the reason is because, how do I start a film? I start it with a dawn shot. Terence Malick used exactly the same music for the beginning of the film he made about the discovery of the New World. What was that called?
The New World.
The New... yeah, that film. But it's this incredible bass opening of these throbbing cellos and double basses. It's just brilliant. And then it builds and builds and builds. Now, the reason to use that is because the story of Das Rheingold is about the gods discovering there is treasure under the ground, and they rip it out. They send people in and they steal it from the Rhine maidens, these magical creatures that live under the ground. In my film, it's the Elder Mother. But they take from below the ground and they build a fantasy land using that gold, and along the way they kill lots of people and they disturb everything and they upset the whole balance of everything, including nature. But the gods do this because they are gods, us. And at the end of the opera, they've built Valhalla, the kingdom of the gods, where they're all going to live in happily, because it's a fantasy. And the opera's about to end, and then out of the floor of the opera house will come Erte, the Earth Mother, and she sings this lament. And the words that Nonny is singing in my film are exactly Wagner's words from the libretto. I know what was, what will be, and what is to come, or whatever it is. And you know enough already. You have been warned. Turn back, hear me, hear me, hear me. And she disappears into the ground. Gods ignore her, go across the bridge, and then the next 4 operas that follow is the consequences of their actions, ending in the twilight of the gods and the death of everyone. And for me, I knew the story of Das Rheingold, and I wanted just to... Now, I don't expect anybody to be watching this film and to pick that up at all. I just know that nobody will. But it doesn't matter. I know it's there. And it's about planting fable. For me, it was about planting fable into this film that I was making. So, yeah, that's the music.
Lovely. Thank you. Before we go to the next question, so in that 12-hour overnight recording, is that where the badger sound comes from?
I'd love to say that the badger sound was from that recording. It wasn't. No, the badger sound was a mix of snuffling,
my snuffling Foley, and Chris's scratching,
and my scratching. So that was done in soft. The badger sound.
We're very committed to our filmmaking practice.
Weirdly, Denzil, not the first time you've played a badger.
Not the first time. Certainly won't be the last.
Yeah. If you need a badger, Denzil is available. Any more questions? Should we just start? Yeah, start there and we'll come down. We'll get to those. We'll come down.
Hi. Can I ask how you go about, or how this film's funded, and how you go about applying for funding and budgeting the whole process?
So this is the worst film to ask that question about, because unlike most films, there was no applying for anything with this. It was something which Chris started doing, and then I joined in, and then there was a small amount of private investment, tiny amount of private investment to just get us through the post-production process, and that was it. So it was very unusual in that process. It's kind of, and I think the questions about applying for funding and all the rest of it, we'll pick that up in the producing seminars in year 2.
I think it's a really good question. It's a really good question. There is an answer that I can give you, which will, I'm not sure I've ever said this, but coming out of lockdown, I think it was in 2020, there was a funding bid for something called the West Penwith Landscape Partnership. They put up a thing saying, we're looking for a filmmaker to make a film that reflects the work that we're doing in West Penwith, 10 grand. And I did apply for that, but I applied for it with a different film, well, a different idea, which was 4 fields. So spring, autumn, summer, winter, in different fields in West Penwith. One of which would have the stone in it. So, and I didn't get it. And you know, somebody else made, I'm sure, a very nice film. But it wasn't, but this film was maybe 6 months later, and that had gone out of my head, and yeah, it's a tricky one. But I think the one thing I would take from this, if you like, is that not every film can be made this way. But sure as eggs, there are a lot of films that could be made this way, you know, and you're in the prime position to do it because you've got access to the most incredible kit for the next 3 years. It's just a question of being able to start. I mean, obviously I was lucky enough to be able to feed myself at the same time. It's not, you know, I appreciate that, but ultimately the barriers to actually making now are so low that those are the important lessons, I think, from my film.
I think there was, I'm going to ask you to repeat one of those quotes again about working with the resources that you've got. You know, it's like, yes, you can, some things need money. Sometimes you need to find, you know, small or large amounts of money to get certain things done. But any idea can evolve with the resources you've got in front of you now. So you might not be able to get to completion with that, but you can, wherever you are in the process, you can you know, talk to other people, and actually it's the best way to think about how to finance a film is how to resource a film. So the support that came from the Sound Image Cinema Lab and the resources that we used in post-production, you know, we could have gone out to look for money and found a commercial solution to that and gone to a studio somewhere and paid a sound engineer to do it. But we worked with you know, with a lower budget, but with bringing in those resources that were around us and were available to us, you know, through the relationships that we sort of built up. So yeah, there's many answers to that question, but the main one is work with the resources you've got.
Make films in accordance with your resources. I think the thing is, yeah, like it's having a lot of different projects ready to go at any time, and yeah, this film could only have been made this way, and you know, but that's the same for every film. There's not one way to make a film, and I think one of the things that we do try and do, particularly on the course, is to really push back against, on all the course, push back against the idea that you need all this stuff to do this. You don't. Yeah, you can find ways around it. You can push things in a different direction and get something really special. And arguably, going down the route of funding, bringing in other, you know, would have pushed this film in a more conventional, you know, it would have, you would
or
have
it might
voices,
not have happened.
Or it might not have happened, or voices would have come into it, which would have made it not the thing that ultimately it is.
It's worth just saying that there is no drone shots in this film because I don't have a drone. And I think it's better for it. And the other thing is, the reason that there is no camera movement is because my tripod was so awful that I couldn't pan or tilt on it. It was a stills tripod. So, and I thought, well, should I go and get one from stores? And I thought, no, yeah. I just started filming and it was really rickety. But it so it dictated the style of the film was because of the resources I had.
Including the one camera move that is in there.
Oh yeah, the camera move, there is one camera move where the starlings are going over the top of the stone, but that's only because I got so excited I nudged the camera.
Yeah, just below you.
So in the context of this being effectively an ecological protest film, how did you feel about about the fact that your time and skills, resources and money are going into a piece of art rather than something more direct, like making a blockade or blowing up a pipeline, those kinds of things.
To mention another film.
Yes.
That's such a good question. Well, number one, I think I said earlier, my nature had never been to protest in that public way, that sphere of things. And you know, if that's a criticism of me, I get that on the chin straight away. But I'll give you a good example. So this film now, when I went on the march with Extinction Rebellion, it was brilliant. I absolutely loved it, and I loved being part of a community of people who were all standing for the things that I passionately believe in, and we marched around Parliament Square and blah blah blah. The only coverage, because there was no violence and because everybody was obeying Extinction Rebellion's request that it be a very peaceful event, which it was. The only coverage that was on the BBC, or across the media rather, right across the media, was that the London Marathon was being run on the same day, and were we going to disrupt the London Marathon? And in fact, the best interview that came out of the whole thing was Chris Brasher, who was running the marathon, saying, no, I've been speaking to Extinction Rebellion for months about this, everything's going to be fine. You know, but actually, it was all negative about the thing. So, we're in a lucky position as filmmakers to do other things. So, I've made this film. I'm about to go on a tour to Exeter, Bristol, Cardiff, Newcastle, Glasgow. This is all next week for me. Leeds, London, where it's going to be shown in cinemas. I'm going on the train. I've got my train hugger app, so every train trip that I go on will plant trees. And I'm going to go around Britain on the train and go and show the film. 2 people to have these same discussions because they've seen the film. And then the film is being shown in Zurich and the film festival there. Now that is the heart of the banking community, Switzerland. So the chances are that a proportion of the people who are going to come and see this film will be in the banking industry. What other way do you get to say your message to a bunch of bankers? I really hope the Westminster have a cinema, and I really hope they do invite films to go. So I really hope that my MP, Derek, if you're listening, will invite me to come and show the film in the heart of Westminster. Now that's different from walking around the outside of Westminster. There is no easy answer to it because I think both are brilliant. I think there has to be a public demonstration. There has to be that. Is it me? I don't know.
I think it's the same answer as how you make a film. How do you make the world a better place? How do you use your agencies? You use what you've got and you start with what you can do. You know, there's a lot of reasons to not stand up to power. There's a lot of reasons to not make a film. There's a lot of reasons to not communicate with people. There's a lot of reasons to not change. It's very easy to just coast along and let things be and think it's somebody else's responsibility or whatever, but to just go, okay, you've got something to say, you're a filmmaker, you've got something to say, make a film, say it, get it out to an audience and then have that conversation. I think that's one of the most powerful tools that we have for society to evolve. If we don't talk to each other about the ideas that are in our head, the things that are worrying us and keeping us awake at night, how are we going to change them? So I think it's really important to, I'm not going to say it's really important to blow up pipelines, it's really important to protest against injustice in whatever way you can, and film is a damn good way of doing it.
I think one of the things about the beginning of the film, there's no mention of climate change for 20 minutes deliberately, as well as the journey that I went on. But by the time I was editing, I would already, I was in a different mindset by the time I was editing. But I kept it free of that because also there's a seduction process that has to happen. If I hit you over the head from the moment my film starts saying, you know, the climate is in crisis. Oh, yeah, okay, we know what this film is. And it's important to sort of seduce people, because I'm not making this for members of Extinction Rebellion. They're already on side. This is for the bankers and for everybody else, you know, for whom maybe, like me, they were struggling to make connections between how do I cope with things that are happening in Africa and wildfires and the Arctic and other places in the world that I've never been to. And this was my solution. Just give you one final thing, is that when I left film school, my first job was to work at Children's BBC and making documentaries for children. And I did it, I just thought, oh, it's a job, I'll go and do it. And then I got there and I realised it's the best job in the world. And I stayed there for nearly 10 years making documentaries for children, because in the 90s, because I realised that if there is one audience that you can influence, it's children. So I made lots of films about social justice issues, refugee crisis, which was happening even then back in the 90s, and all those sort of things, because actually changing the hearts and minds of adults is a lot harder. So if one piece of advice I could give you is making work for children is a brilliant and very beautiful thing to do.
Nice. Yeah, I think it's thinking about the kind of the power of cinema as a political tool is important. And Sai says, film is a mirror that reflects the details of the world, living life, our bodies, etc. Which I think this film does beautifully, and it's important to remember. Where was the next one? Yeah, thank you.
So when people talk about climate change, it's often people either consider it a political issue because it's so sort of interwoven and it's so sort of necessary to talk about those kind of things when considering it. But then people also consider it completely separate because it's nature and it's sort of, it's, you know, it's different to that. I was wondering if you considered your film political or not.
Yeah, of course it is. Yes, it is political. It has to be political.
I don't think anything isn't political, really. And I was just thinking about two different audience members' reactions to some of the previous screenings of this. One, somebody in the audience said, "I'm never buying a salad bag again." So there was a direct action as a direct result of the film. And somebody else, I think after the first or second screening at Sheffield, came up afterwards, walked up to Chris and said, "How do we solve climate change then?" Which was quite a big ask.
Yeah, I mean, I think your question's brilliant, actually. I didn't set out to make a political film. I was just filming the stone and this thing emerged. But it obviously becomes political, and it obviously becomes a polemic in that way. Actually, it was reviewed in The Guardian today, and the reporter, the film reviewer, really enjoyed the mesmeric kind of feel of the film, the use of the way nature is portrayed within the film. But she balked a bit at what she called the hectoring of my statements around towards the end of the film around things connected with climate change. I've got some sympathy with her, but at the end of the day, we are in a situation where hectoring is really important. Even today with Rishi Sunak rolling back ridiculously on pledges, hectoring has never been more important. So it's political in that sense, but it's a very personal politics. And it's not a politics of the left or the right, it's a politics of injustice for future generations. That's how I saw it in my head. And in the way, I hope the film has hope in it, through the metaphor of the young people going to Milan and those and the barley seeds just falling on the ground and saying, I was going, up yours. I'm going saying, up yours. I don't care. I'm going to grow, and I'm going to grow in my own way. And no matter what is happening in terms of farming, I'm just going to grow. And I think that's the metaphor for the end for me, which makes it a hopeful piece. I hope people have that.
Something which you talked about since making the film, maybe a bit whilst we were making it, but certainly since making the film, and as we sort of looked at how to describe it and portray it to the world, is kind of thinking about all of those big ecological climate change films where, you know, crashing glaciers and the world on fire and all of these kind of images, they make you feel really powerless. You know, it's like sometimes they have the opposite effect of what the intention is with those things. Yes, it's important to be aware that those things are happening, but if you feel like it's Armageddon and you can't do anything about it, that's a very powerless place to sit in. And I think because it is so personal, what this film does for me as an audience member of this film, what it does is it makes me think. Yes, there's all these things going on, and all of these things are interconnected, but it is ultimately, you know, you in whatever sphere of influence you have, which might be tiny, it might be large, it will certainly fluctuate for your life, is to just kind of be who you are and be where you are, and to be present. I think more than anything, that's what this film does, is it slows down to be present, and to actually, that in itself is quite an act of rebellion in this world.
I was going to ask, what sort of hardships did you face whilst you were filming?
I can't even see who that is. Who's speaking? Oh, hello. Hardships. Oh, terrible hardship.
Got a bit wet sometimes.
I got very wet. None really. Not in terms of real hardship. This is hardly I was going to the Arctic. But in a way, actually, it was obsessional. And I found myself leaving, getting out of bed at 4 in the morning, 2 in the morning, being there till 11 at night. It just became a sort of for an entire year, an all-consuming passion. So there was no hardship in the making. In fact, because it's at a mile from my house, you know, I walked to the location more often than not. I cycled to it often, or if I was driving past on the way back from to somewhere else, you know, I'm teaching 2 days a week here at Falmouth, or on the way back, I would stop. You know, if there was something, I'd occasionally just stop. Sometimes I saw a squall coming in, and I, you know, get in the car and go, because if I had walked, I wouldn't have been able to get there in time. So, you know, carbon was burnt in the making. But in terms of hardship, no, I didn't. Well, actually, the hardship was actually coming to terms with it in my own head, that it had any worth. And I know that sounds really stupid because I'm an experienced filmmaker, but it's still that thing. And now, actually, when I'm screening it, when I was screening it last week in Serbia, I was amongst 7 films that had been chosen for this festival, and the other films were magnificent. They were just incredible, and the incredible sense of imposter syndrome. Well, this is just me in a field with a rickety tripod, and what, you know, honestly, are they, you know, and maybe it speaks to a British audience, but what on earth will the Serbs make of it? And you know, you can't help those feelings. I think they're actually really important for the creative process, to be honest. But yeah, the biggest hardship was probably getting over my own feelings that it was a bit crap.
We've got time for one more, which is up the back. So, yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you took influence from the cinematographer of Kernow. Were the contrasts between like the macro shots and the really wide angle massive landscapes, were they deliberately planned?
Yeah, I mean, if you watch Baraka or any of those programs, you know, I love films that move from. In my documentary work, my lens is always wide, full frame, or it is in. I try not to use the middle of the lens too much. The standard television mid-shot. Even when I'm working in television, I try to use the ends of the interesting ends of the lenses. With the camera that I was using, do you know what camera I was using? I don't know whether anybody said anything. So it was all shot on my phone. So the iPhone 12 Pro Max was what I had, and it has an outstanding macro option. The time-lapse sequences, I didn't use the standard time-lapse you get on your iPhone. I downloaded some app that I can't even remember what it's called because it was very good, and I did that. But the rest of it was shot on my phone using the standard. I bought a bunch of things to attach to the iPhone, none of which were any good, so I chucked those. And I just used the lenses and the natural compressions and things that were in the iPhone. Now, that's why Michael Todd, who was our grader, lavished weeks of work on it. So, for example, in the shots of the where it's really misty, you'd get banding because the iPhone couldn't cope with the gradation, that subtle gradation of the thing. But you know, Michael had a button and he pressed the button and that went. He literally did press them. Oh, you mean the banding button? Oh yeah, there we go. It was, you know, the modern technology applied at the back end really helped the iPhone image to get it to the point where it actually looks okay on the big screen. But I'm quite glad, if you didn't really know, we don't advertise it as an iPhone movie because I think it's reductive. People will come looking at the images and go, "Oh, hasn't he done well?" You know, but actually, it's much better to go in and you just watch it. It's a movie, and then fine, it was just shot very simply on a very small tripod with a very small camera.
It does go to show though, it's not about, you know, there are definite choices about what format you shoot your films on, but it's not as much about that as it is about the ideas and the skills of the person using it. So yeah, I think it's a simple tool, but there's 30 years experience going into working that simple tool, and it shows.
And there were so many shots I wouldn't have got had I not had the iPhone, like the thing coming out, the plane coming out the top of in a very phallic way out to the top of the birds flying past.
The first teaser we put up on YouTube was taken down because of that image.
Yeah.
Outrageous. Controversial film. Who knew? Right. Well,
it's controversial the fact that it's now a 12A because it's got one F word in it. Can you believe that the censors will allow children to watch incredible amounts of violence and disturbing stuff, but this film, you have to be 12 or over to watch it. Actually, it's not a bad thing. Maybe you do have to be 12 to watch it, but it's because of the F word. Crazy.
Well, yeah, because we talked about that a lot, didn't we, on the release? The release, it was a kind of weird, just such a weird response. But thinking about it, 12A is accompanied with a parent. So I think it's interesting that, you know, parents and their children have to watch it together.
Which means maybe you should target Rishi's children for getting it, and then he'll have to
have to take their dad for the movies. He needs to watch more movies. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for the questions. I'd like to close with a side quote, which is: "Film is not only about storytelling, but can sometimes be closer to poetry." Which I think is something that we believe, and I think this film definitely has many moments of kind of real poetic beauty. So congratulations on the film, good luck on the tour. To all of you, while you're here for 3 years, spend some time in West Penwith with some stones. But for now, let's thank our guests, Denzil and Chris.
Thanks to the Poly for hosting the screening. Thanks to Denzil and Chris for joining me on stage. I really enjoyed that conversation, and really enjoyed spending time again thinking about the film and kind of how it's being received by audiences and how that and the potential sort of things that it sort of brings out of audiences. So, Dario, you've seen the film and heard the conversation. What are your sort of thoughts on it all?
Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful meditative piece that is impressive simply by the fact of that it was shot on a phone, and it has that sort of sense of patience and kind of micro detail, but yet speaking to universal kind of cosmic themes, of time and nature and existence and all of that kind of thing. And yeah, I mean, there's no plot to speak of. So once you've said, it's really great to look at that. I mean, it's no good on a podcast, is it? Because the audience has to see it the audience has to see the film for themselves to really see what I mean by that. But just the sort of the vividness of the way it depicts nature, but also not in that. I mean, it's impressive, but in a much more low key, but equally profound, as you might see on one of the big BBC nature documentaries. But it's very much got that contemplative philosophical element that people mentioned with regards to something like Koyaanisqatsi. Yeah, and interestingly, one of the things that sort of struck me was and this came out in the interview as well, was the question of hope. And I am increasingly kind of hopeless, I think, when it comes to getting to the point of understanding what the possibilities of the human race kind of saving itself. And maybe that is really pessimistic, but it doesn't have the kind of grand hopefulness of Koyaanisqatsi, that's for sure. And it's interesting because I've seen quite a number of what I would broadly call eco films over the last 2 or 3 years. There's quite a few of them at the Berlin Film Festival, I thought, that weren't necessarily overtly environmentalist politically, but they have this sort of quality of what I would call contemplative dystopia as a style. And yeah, it's almost as if there's an acceptance of the end in some way, sort of riven through the tone of many of these films. And yeah, I mean, Chris is right in the sense of the didacticism of the environmental injustice doesn't really kick in until sort of a third of the way into the film. And I've seen a review that sort of, the one negative thing that it said about the film was the sort of didacticism of the tone of the voiceover at certain points. But even that to me is exceptionally mild. And I think maybe we could talk a little bit later, more broadly about whether film can enact any political change anymore. And I just feel like that there is this cycle of films coming out now that don't have any solutions because nobody has any solutions. So what's happening is filmmakers are kind of like making films that are almost time capsules for what the Earth once looked like, and it's almost as if, I mean, I don't think this is intentional, but this reads to me like a film that if it's picked up in 100 years' time, people would look at it and go, "Oh yeah, do you remember when the Earth looked like that?" There's almost a sort of depressive nostalgia to it. And I know that sounds really downbeat, but I don't know what like many filmmakers, I think, who work and many activists who work in the environmental sense, or in the that's their political agenda, and it should be everyone's political agenda for sure. It's almost as if what is there to say artistically beyond making a film, as Denzil sort of pointed out, that smashes everything up and burns everything to the ground in terms of political systems. You can do that, but you can also make a film like this, which kind of is much more meditative and sort of looks at the Earth and existence and nature in this sort of cosmic universalist sense. But really, neither of those options offer up a solution. So maybe those are the only two kind of avenues that filmmakers have.
Yeah, and I think it's tricky, isn't it? Because it's that idea of what is a political cinema is something that we covered when we talked about the Falmouth Film Weekend, the Laura Mulvey episode, and
Sure.
And this idea of like, where is the kind of political located in cinema, and oftentimes it is in what is termed experimental cinema, and in documentary, but I think in a different way. This feels much closer to that kind of experimental film politics in terms of it being a very subjective, experiential film, where Chris is clearly kind of leading us through a kind of personal experience in the way that a lot of, experimental cinema has done, and a personal politics evolves, and I think that the film invites your own personal politics into play in a way that isn't didactic. It's almost like kind of, one way, which I think why, sort of there has been the response that's growing around the film is one of a kind of, I think an audience is surprised at how engaged they've found it. I think people are going to they think they're going to see a film about a standing stone, which it is, but it's not, the other stuff sort of creeps up on you. And I think because it crept up on Chris, I think that's what's really interesting, is that the film's structure reflects that kind of personal awakening, which feels very genuine, and I think there are a lot of films which are trying to, and a lot of sort of television are trying to tap into, questions of Englishness or kind of, relationship to land or, kind of Celtic, histories, but they're kind of going to those places, asking those questions. And I think that this is a film which has come out of someone who was, clearly very connected to the place and has then sort of just been responding to things that are felt over a long period of time. And so, it feels like that kind of personal expression. And, there is this idea, which kind of I've spoken to Chris and Denzil about, which is the idea of like the specific is universal, and I do think that there's the specificness of the place and Chris's relationship to that place is what makes it something which people can find connection to, even if they live in a city around the world which doesn't have any standing stones. It's about feeling that engagement with the place in a way which just reframes your relationship to where you live in a very, very immediate sense. And from there, a personal hope about, I could do this and this would change this seems to be possible. And I don't think if you're going to have hope that you can have hope anywhere else. I don't think you can have hope in a structural change or a corporate change or a kind of global change in terms of our relationship to the climate. The only hope I think you can have is that you can find it in yourself to do something which makes a difference, and that has an accumulative effect amongst enough people to see some kind of change, that then makes everything else inevitable. But it's a big ask. But
yeah,
it's and I think as well that a film like this kind of does put you back in mind, which I guess I'd be interested, because I think there's me living in Cornwall. I can feel this film in a different way because of my environment, but you live in the middle of London, so the things that the film is almost kind of inviting you to be able to do must feel very different in terms of the city, and London particularly, which is kind of, a mega city.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that, and there's a lot I want to sort of pick up on, because what you're sort of advocating for there, and I think Denzil sort of talks about it, and this isn't the fault of the film, and it's not the fault of the process of the film, which is fascinating, in a technical sense, but also in the contextual sense of, coming out of COVID, and we've all sort of lived through that, and we've all had that impact on us in certain ways. Yeah, you're right. It's not just that I live in London. It's the fact I am an out and out city boy, and I'm not a fan of the idea of nostalgically returning to a pre-modern state of nature, or neither to kind of embrace the idea of the answer to all of our problems is a kind of Beltane folksiness. I'm sorry if that sounds condescending. I really don't mean it to, but do you know what I mean? It's not. I think that's naive in many ways. But I'm glad. The film didn't lean into that too much. I really like the sort of metaphysics of time, and the sense of human epicness and smallness in the face of time and nature. But yeah, just on that sort of sense of the individual, I mean, again, it's so difficult, isn't it? Because really, if there is going to be any change on a significant scale, it has to be in the community, or there has to be a sort of solidarity with others, and that the wider that solidarity is, the more possible change is going to take place. And I think there is a danger with this kind of approach to environmentalism, that you just have to look after your own individual little bit of land, the world, your family. It does speak to a kind of soft left passivity, I think, and it's a difference, say, between that kind of documentary filmmaking and, say, the documentary filmmaking of the third cinema, which, and you could say, well, that never succeeded in sort of changing people's minds, but at least it was absolutely about the collective and making people call to action to do things that challenge power systems. And I think the problem with the whole look after your bit of land, sort of way of thinking is that you're going to end up, I mean, maybe you'll be all right in Cornwall, but you're going to end up being, the Omega Man, or like a little bit like sort of Jenks's Enys Men, a sort of last person on earth kind of thing. And I sort of disagree with that. I think it's too individualized, but I have a very specific sort of take on this as well, in terms of that. I've talked about in the past about a kind of pragmatic nihilism about the response to this. And again, just to finish off, you could say as well that the individualized reaction is exactly what the powers that be want, because they know that individual small actions are easily containable within the system of power as it stands. Sorry to be like, I mean, I don't know, I'm not sorry. It's kind of, I think it's an interesting debate to have in those terms. But this is nothing to do with, I think this is nothing to do with the quality of the film as an artifact. I think it's just interesting that, that question of where film lies as a political possibility.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I'll push back slightly, I think, because I think that, one of the things about Cornwall that I've sort of realised and learned and sort of been sort of part of is that it's not a place of individuals. It is a place of community. And this film was made in a community way. I mean, it's very much Chris's story, but, that it was made in a way that, rejects long-standing ideas about how a film that can play cinemas can get made and find its way to the screen. That the community of people that are around it, like Andy Stark at Anti-Worlds, who are distributing the film, and Stone Club, and kind of the people involved in the sort of the finishing of the film through the uni are kind of evidence of that. And I think that there is a kind of I would say a political nostalgia, in the sense of trying to preserve something which is meaningful in Cornwall, which is a sense of community. And post-COVID, what's been interesting is that that Cornwall has been subject to the influx of people fleeing London, and for the most part, it's kind of resisted those kind of London by the sea possibilities that other places have been subjected to, where we're kind of getting out to the coast and then working remotely and stuff. And because of the way Cornwall is and its infrastructure, it's never going to be able to do that, really, and it doesn't want to do that. And there is a kind of a pushback against actually, if you allowing people to just come here and retain that kind of individualness at the expense of what is really meaningful and possible down here. And it feels like sometimes it can feel a bit guardian-y, but oftentimes it does feel like there is a real sense of community, which is kind of doing things differently to that, which is, you're right, is not how everybody thinks that societal problems are going to be solved. And it's certainly not going to, there's not going to be huge radical change, which is kind of felt across the country. I think that a lot of that is to do with Cornwall's relationship to the rest of the British Isles, which dates back to a very long time. But yeah, that may be it may be naive, but it certainly feels like small local community change is possible, and other models can grow, which at least kind of ask the question of why certain things are still being done the same way, and nothing is being done. And that idea, well, you can't do anything, Cornwall seems to be a place where there are many examples of ways of doing things around farming, around sort of community, sort of social support that, could be scaled up and could make it, change. And then that question is asked at a political level. And it's no coincidence that this is, a place where a lot of this happens despite a kind of Tory stronghold and a sort of long-standing, sort of series of MPs with supposedly, the interests of a place like Cornwall in their portfolio, who have no interest in engaging with it on a local level in their own constituency, let alone on a national level, which makes it a bit more political. But I think what I'm sort of proud of in terms of being involved in the film is that, I think it does more than you would think on the surface. And I think in some of the places where it's going to play might just make people feel like, oh, actually, that there are things in my own community or our own community when we watch it that they maybe didn't realize were as potentially powerful in terms of a community response than they thought before they saw the film, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no. I think it does. I think actually probably what Chris and Denzil sort of meant, and again, without I really don't want to feel like I'm putting words in their mouth, but rather than the film, I mean, if the film is a subjective individual response, which is, that's fine. That's exactly what it is. But then I guess the wider political outcome would be much more akin to a sense of the individual's responsibility to the community, as you're sort of alluding to there, I think. But then, nice. Like so in a place like Cornwall, then if individuals have a community kind of spirit, or there are sort of definite actions taking place in terms of constructing society and culture at the benefit of the community as a whole. Again, even that could be insulated if you are not being profoundly activist against, like you say, the sort of incoming holiday homers from London. Do you know what I mean? Because that's the thing that you're fighting against. So, say for example, if you had whatever kind of local community structures form and individuals' responsibilities to them, then you've got a question of what do you do with that? Do you just kind of take the crumbs and build up things in spite of the influence of money from the outside and interests from the outside that are not the interests of the community, or do you literally fight back? And I know a lot of communities and towns are fighting back in various ways, but it's very, very difficult. And of course, then you've got the future and what that's going to look like when Cornwall may become a more populous destination because people are looking to get outside of the cities for whether it's for economic or environmental reasons. So I think it's such a complex picture, and I realize we've kind of gone away from the nuts and bolts of the movie itself, but actually I think that is the strength of the movie. It does that. I mean, your way into it with Simon Yang is great, and the quote about what local cinema should do is really vital. And I think that at the first instance, this allows you the space to have a questioning of the outside, of the world, of society, and of yourself, which is the starting point, I think, for a political cinema.
Absolutely, yeah, nicely put. Yeah, and I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's further evidence of a kind of what is going on in Cornwall, but it is also kind of using cinema as one means of starting or continuing a conversation, which is what a political cinema should be doing, and has done historically. And I think that the question that came out of the Q&A in terms of that sort of reminded me that maybe there is a greater gap between sort of cinema and politics than I hoped. You know, there would be in terms of a younger generation, in terms of seeing the potential for cinema to be part of that kind of political conversation. And again, I use the word cinema rather than film because, you know, thinking that there is a poetry and a beauty to the film, you know, that means that it's more than just a kind of didactic, preachy, you know, kind of call to arms. That there's something extra textual going on in the aesthetics that, kind of make it cinema, and also invite all this stuff that we've ended up talking about, which I think is felt in the film, you know. And I think because you are, you know, a politically engaged viewer, that subjectivity has a space in the film, which is really exciting, and hopefully other audiences will feel the same.
Lovely. Well, really enjoyed that chat, actually. I think it's obviously something we're probably going to return to. And just congratulations to Chris and Denzil and the team. And if Chris wants to come to Ravensbourne University, we'd love to have him screen the film there at some point in the future. But lovely to talk to you, Neil, and really great to be back on the podcasting horse, as it were.
Yeah, back with a bang. Nice deep chat to kick things off. No slow intro here.
Indeed, and we'll definitely get some bonus material up there very soon, which will maybe a little bit more free form in terms of what we're watching and what we're devouring as we move into the autumn season.
Yeah, and I'll be posting something this week from sort of a visit I made down to the Stone with Chris and Denzil. So there's a little bit of extra content coming your way too.
Lovely. So that will just about do it. As I said at the beginning, any reviews or shout outs or shares that you can do of the podcast, we'd really love to see that. And we always try and mention people who've mentioned us out and about, whether it's digitally or in analog terms. If you want to go that extra mile, we really would welcome some support on Patreon. It's very cheap. Just £2 a month is the basic rate, and you do get a lot of bonus material now, stretching back quite a few years, and of course our monthly newsletter. Neil, looking forward to London FF?
Yeah, big time. I've been sort of plugging a few gaps in terms of some filmmakers whose films are showing. I think it's a really great lineup. I'm really excited, and I'm excited to talk to you about it as well.
Yeah, it looks great. That's what my Saturday morning is going to be, sort of filling out my calendar of what I can get to see around my full-time job, of course. But that's it. Until next time, this has been the Cinematologists podcast. Thanks for listening.